How sports teams divide the United States can truly be a very fascinating thing, and we're going to look at that with this map. First of all, the NBA, this is an east west line, since that's all that really matters. And because more people live on the east side of the US as compared to the west side of the US, you can begin to see why it's so unbalanced this way. Because looking at the line, it cuts around central Wisconsin, then through central Illinois, the western edge of Kentucky, and into central Tennessee, and then right down Alabama. And there's a reason for this. Because the Atlanta Hawks are in the east, but the New Orleans Pelicans are in the west. So the split would be around Alabama. And if you're wondering why Mississippi's in here and why a lot of Tennessee's in the west, then you have Memphis Grizzlies fans. But in most of Kentucky, they'll be fans of the Indianapolis Pacers, who are in the east. You have Chicago Bulls on this side, and I don't think St. Louis is a basketball team. But if you get too close in this part of Illinois, you could again wind up in Kansas City territory. In Wisconsin, you do have the Bucks over here, but the Minnesota Wild is in the west, so that explains the divide. What's even weirder is that parts of Florida would adhere to the west because Pensacola is not that far from New Orleans, and we know that the Pelicans play there, but it's so weird to see how far east that line is and how a state on the Atlantic Ocean, part of it is like closer to the west than their fan base. Hockey, though, the east-west line is even further east. And a lot of that just has to simply do with the fact that Central is in the Western Division and so is Pacific. There's a lot of teams in Canada that are not represented here. This is just a U.S. map, and in most sports, I'd say it doesn't really matter, but in Canada, it really does. The Atlanta NHL team, the oh no, not the Winnipeg Jets. Does Atlanta have an NHL team? I'm gonna look it up on my phone. So no, Atlanta does not currently have a team. Um, Hard to say what fan base they feed into. I guess the Nashville Predators, who are in Central. Again, that line is far east because I mean the Red Wings are on the eastern side of the U.S. But once you get into Chicago territory, Michigan is split cleanly in half. Once you get to the Chicago territory, Chicago Blackhawks, they are in Central. The Indiana NHL team, the no, there's no professional hockey team in Indiana. So they feed in Chicago, and that's why all of Indiana feeds into Central. Most of Kentucky and Tennessee and half of Georgia would feed into Central, which is the western U.S. But funnily enough, Central is really big because half of Montana would also feed into this. Why? I guess the Avalanche. I guess the Avalanche would cause it to be so big, but I mean, I still don't get. I mean, maybe Arizona doesn't have an NHL team, but like almost all of Arizona, including Phoenix, would feed into this, and the only parts of that wouldn't are the parts close to Las Vegas. Oh no, there's the Arizona Coyotes, and the Arizona Coyotes are still in Central, even though they're literally in Pacific time. It's massive. It also cuts across half of Utah, um, and it goes along the Idaho-Wyoming border. So that must mean that there's a lot of teams that are directly on the West Coast. Then the East is split up rather weirdly because of the Atlantic covering both the northern and southern parts of the U.S. Why the northern? Because you have the Red Wings and the Buffalo Sabres and the um, Boston Bruins, and in the South you have the Florida teams, the Panthers and the Lightning. Whereas in the Metropolitan Division, then that's where it cuts across through there, and you have teams like the Flyers and the Capitals and the Islanders, Rangers, Devils, Penguins. I think the Hurricanes also. So again, like kind of throughout central Georgia, past that line into Central is where that would be, and on the northern end of things, it would go through the Great Lakes, and it would kind of cut across southern New York, just above the New York metropolitan area, because most of New England feeds into the Bruins. The MLB is easier, but I wanted to know something. Central cuts into Pennsylvania, and that's because of the Pittsburgh Pirates. That's also why the line between East and Central cuts cleanly through West Virginia. It also cuts halfway through Alabama and goes on the eastern edge of Tennessee. Kentucky is pretty much all in Central. As for Florida, I think like the Pensacola area would feed into Central, but almost all of it feeds into East. Why is that? Well, because in Florida and the East, you have the Rays and the Marlins, and you also have the Braves up there, and they're also in the East. That's waiting for Alabama, and past that, there aren't really any baseball teams in this area of the country, so they would either have to feed into the Astros or feed into the Cardinals, because there's like literally nothing closer than those teams. Um, Although by the point of the Astros, you're actually in the West, so I don't know how. So they're probably not Astros fans either. Um, then cutting up Tennessee again, you get into a lot of Cardinals territory. And once you get to Kentucky, you begin to get in the Cincinnati Reds fan base. West Virginia is cut cleanly in half, I guess, because you have the Pirates on one side and Nationals on the other. The Michigan is fully in Central this time because again, Detroit Tigers are in the Central leagues. But then you have this line cutting across the West. Almost all of Texas is in the West because both the Houston Astros and the Texas Rangers play in the AL West. It then begins to curve somewhat northwesterly, but most of Oklahoma feeds into that. And again, a big reason why Oklahoma would feed into that is because Oklahoma, most of them are Rangers fans, although you can get into Royals territory when you're in Oklahoma, and I don't even know why this part of Texas would even feed into that at all, but I don't know. The Astros are an unpopular team. Cuts halfway through Kansas because you have the Royals on one side. On the other side, I don't know how, it's Colorado Rockies territory. I don't understand why, or maybe they're still Rangers fans. Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, but by the time we get to North Dakota, the Dakotas, most of them are in Central because most of them feed to the Minnesota Twins, as opposed to, say, the Rockies. And after the Rockies, you have to go to the Seattle Mariners to find another team, and both of them kind of suck. But you can see how the West, in this case, would take up most of the country. Football, perhaps the hardest thing to understand. This map is so confusing. Because look at this East, and it's so obvious why the East struts out that way. It's Dallas Cowboys territory, which would take up most of Texas, the other part being split between the South and the West, cutting through Oklahoma, Arkansas, and even into Missouri? That makes no sense. Then you have the East line cut across Florida because of the Miami Dolphins territory, as opposed to the other teams, Jaguars and Buccaneers, where they feed into the South. On the East Coast, you have this weird janky line up the northeastern edge of North Carolina into Virginia. Weirdly cuts across West Virginia and Maryland, and then goes back around Pennsylvania, and that covers the East. Like, I don't know. And that's the East. The West. Okay, so Western Texas feeds into the West. I guess they feed it into the Arizona Cardinals because New Mexico doesn't have a team, or either the Denver Broncos. Then it goes through like half of Oklahoma. Kansas is entirely in the West because of the Chiefs. Missouri, partly still, most of it feeds into the West. So that would explain all that stuff. And then that line bordering the north cuts through southern Iowa, into South Dakota, and then through the northeastern parts of Montana. Now again, Vikings would cover all of North Dakota, most of South Dakota, so that would make sense why they're there. They don't even go into Montana. The north and the south, because they do directly border, goes through central Illinois, central Indiana, then on the Ohio-Kentucky border. West Virginia is like the tri-point for the south, east, and north, because On one side, you have the Bengals and Steelers. On the other side of West Virginia, you get into the Titans, and on the other side, you have the Commanders. And they really just split it up in like such a weird way. You can see all of those divides because it's weird because the Colts are in the south and yet the Bengals are in the north. Indianapolis is north of Cincinnati, so this really makes no sense. The east and the south, and later the west and the south line would cut across southern Texas because you do have Texans fans into central Arkansas and then through St. Louis and then up into Illinois. And yes, parts of Illinois are seriously in the West Territory, I guess because of the Chiefs, but this truly makes no sense. Oh my God.